So this question is centered around Guatemala and Gloria Nunez, which is the community activist that we chose for that country. So women are some of the most active and most vocal activists, often found at the forefront of the fight for survival, representation, rights, and growth of the Garifuna. You wrote about this in your open letter to Black Indigenous women working to preserve history and culture. So how are women treated and viewed within the community? And what do you see as the biggest obstacle in their pursuit of more political involvement, like what Gloria Nunez is advocating for?
Well, I would say the men are in the way, as we are always in the way. So, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think it's important to acknowledge that Garifuna society, Garifuna sociality is matrilineal. It is a matrilineal, matrifocal community. And I would also say that most, I would say over the majority of Black diaspora communities, right, are matrilineal, right? Black women hold an incredibly important role in the household that's not just simply domesticized like white women, right? Or simply just placed in this kind of like, yeah, she's in charge, but the men have the final word, right? I mean, I think Black women have always had the final word, right? And have made the final word not only about themselves, but about the collective, right? So Garifuna women function like every other Black women in the Americas, right? They are at the bedrock of all of the things. What I think happens a lot, though, is that machismo, machismo, patriarchy, misogynoir gets in the way of a lot of that development. It gets away in a lot of even the ideas of like, what Garifuna women should be involved in. Miriam Miranda is a beautiful example of what a Garifuna woman who does not allow machismo or misogynoir to block her, in the sense of like, how do I explain this? Because I think what I'm trying to also say is that the men get in the way in a really intentional way, right? And Garifuna men want to be at the UN, right? They want to be at the podium. They want to be at the top of the hill, right? But they don't put in the political labor that Garifuna women do, right? So it's really, really hard to see when I see Garifuna men take the limelight, and knowing good and well that the only reason that Garifuna man is standing there is because there was a Garifuna woman that made it possible, right? And I think that's the part that it gets constantly frustrating, is to see these moments where you're like, nope, this man would not be would not be close to anything here if it wasn't for Miriam Miranda, right? And we had someone like Celio Alvarez, who was one of the founding leaders of this Black Central American organization called ODECO, Organización de Desarrollo Étnico Comunitario. And it was it was another Garifuna-based organization in Honduras that starts decades after Ofrane, which is the Miriam Miranda's organization. Right. And this is just more like a lot of internal politics, but so much of it is gendered, and so much of the fight, so much of the original fight, and where there's like a bunch of like splits within the Garifuna activist community, is because of gender, right? Because men didn't want a woman at the forefront. They did not want a woman leading. They thought women were good to do the cultural stuff, but they didn't think women were good to deal with the president of Honduras, or they didn't think they were good to send over to the United Nations, right? They didn't think they were good to send them in these high stakes politics.
And is this like rooted in the Garifuna culture, or is this residual of post-colonial influences? I see in a lot of cultures, when the Western, world comes in, all of a sudden there's the sexism and all that stuff, when before there was more acceptance and all of that. So
yeah, I would say yes, right? Okay. I would say absolutely. But I would also say that I don't romanticize the fact that we're matrilineal. Okay. I don't, right? I think women have been the bedrock of everything we do, but I also think some of it is deeply performative, in the sense of like some of the ways in which other Garifuna folks honor women is performative, because what does it mean to only honor women for their cultural? So much of the letter that I wrote, right, and for this piece, a love letter to Indigenous Blackness, is about like the cultural work you're doing is political.
Yeah.
The cultural work you're doing is theoretical. It's intellectual. It's not just shaking your hips, right? Your hips hold centuries of history, right? Like, part of that love letter was to say, fuck all these other men that want to be in suits and ties and want to be rubbing shoulders with the powerful men of the globe. What you're doing in these ceremonies, what you're doing in these public performances, what you're doing in these dance workshops, this is political work too, right? And this is intellectual work that needs to get validated, that needs to get centered, right? That needs to get dismissed because, oh, this is just a performance.
And art is political.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, that's completely.